The Wild West, a name that conjures images of lonely cowboys, dawn duels, and dusty towns. But behind the myth lay a more complex, harsher, and often harsher reality. It wasn't a romantic place of adventure. It was a land of dust, hunger, and violence. Here, every day was a struggle for survival. Forget what you think you know. Forget the white-hatted heroes and the clean gunfights. This isn't a legend. This is 1875. They call it the frontier, but it's only the edge of the world they know, a place where rules blur under a relentless sun. This is the real West, a place of dust, sweat, rusted iron, and bleached bones. For 19th century America, the frontier wasn't a fixed line, but a shifting zone, expanding westward as settlers advanced. Behind them lay the established cities of the East. Ahead lay little explored lands, populated by Native Americans, bison, and vast deserts. It was the place where the rule of law ended and the rule of the fittest began. So thousands of settlers left the East Coast in search of land, fortune in the gold mines, or simply a new beginning. It was a vast territory, loosely controlled by authorities, where each day could mean prosperity or death. On the frontier, there were no solid institutions. There were no judges, police, roads, doctors, or schools. Many communities organized themselves, with local rules, and violence was the quickest way to resolve disputes. Justice, if it came late. That's why the frontier was seen as a place of danger, adventure, and opportunity. The West wasn't just landscapes of plains and deserts. It was also a land of cultural clashes. Settlers clashed with indigenous peoples who were defending their ancestral territories. For indigenous peoples, the frontier was the home they had inhabited for centuries. For settlers, it was free land to be cultivated and exploited. This generated wars, forced displacement, and a brutal clash between two ways of life. The frontier was a space of conquest and dispossession, but also of resistance. Bandits and outlaws robbed stagecoaches, trains, and banks, and sheriffs, often overwhelmed, tried to maintain order in towns where a misinterpreted glance could end in a duel in the middle of the street. The families who settled on these lands lived isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor. Farming was a risky venture. Extreme weather could ruin crops, and attacks by bandits or the arrival of speculators could wipe out what little they had. The frontier was a place of hope for some and condemnation for others. Cowboys and miners were fundamental to the Wild West, although their real lives were marked by harshness rather than the romanticism portrayed in movies. The cowboy was a ranch hand, not a gunfighter. His life revolved around cattle, rounding up, branding, sorting cattle, and driving huge herds across hundreds of miles. They slept under the stars, around makeshift fires, with rough blankets as their only shelter. The routine was grueling, 14 to 16-hour days on horseback, enduring sun, cold, storms, and the constant danger of stampedes. They earned little, around $25 to $40 a month. With luck, they could save some, but most spent as soon as they got to town, especially on alcohol, gambling, and women in saloons. They had no job security or medical insurance. A broken leg or a fever could mean the end of their life as a cowboy. A quarter were African Americans, many of them former slaves after the Civil War. There were also a large number of Mexicans and mestizos, direct heirs to the vaqueria traditions of northern Mexico. Some Native Americans worked as cowboys, although there were also tensions. Rodeos grew out of their daily work, roping, bronc riding, and demonstrating skill with cattle. These events transformed into spectacles that united people. The cowboy style, hat, boots, and bandana, became a cultural symbol and later a myth of individual freedom. At that time, there was a gold and silver rush. The California Gold Rush began in 1848, when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill. Thousands of people from the United States, Mexico, Europe, China, and South America traveled west in hopes of striking it rich. Silver veins were soon discovered in Nevada and Colorado, and small mines in South Dakota and Montana, sparking new waves of adventurers. The miners' lives were marked by the hope of getting rich quickly. Many walked, rode, or sailed for weeks or months to reach the mining camps. The journey was dangerous. Disease, hunger, bandit attacks, and extreme weather conditions. Not everyone survived, and of those who did, only a few found enough metal to get rich. The camps they settled in were makeshift, canvas tents, wooden huts, or caves. Supplies were scarce, so food was meager and repetitive. Beans, salted meat, or stale bread. Hygiene was conspicuously lacking, leading to epidemics of cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. The miners worked 10 to 12 hours a day under extreme conditions, unstable tunnels, minimal ventilation, and primitive tools, pick, shovel, and pan. The silver and gold mines generated dust that caused silicosis and other lung diseases. Collapses, explosions, and dynamite accidents were frequent. The camps were full of cultural diversity. Americans, Mexicans, Europeans, Chinese, and African Americans shared space under harsh conditions. The law was weak or non-existent, and conflicts were resolved with violence. Disputes over or deposits, robberies, and gambling. Local businesses sprang up, saloons, stores, makeshift barbershops, but all were short-lived. Many towns disappeared when the ore was exhausted, becoming ghost towns. So when the gold or silver deposits were exhausted, the towns lost their reason for existence. Many inhabitants left in search of new mines or more prosperous cities. Within years or even months, the place was abandoned, leaving empty houses, saloons, and stores. For example, Bodie, California, which had a population of over 10,000 in 1880, but when mining declined, it became deserted and is now an open-air museum, or Rhyolite, Nevada, which flourished after the discovery of gold in 1904, but by the 1910s was completely abandoned. Today, ghost towns are tourist attractions and historical monuments, but in their time, they represented the risk, excitement, and tragedy of those seeking fortune. The mining rush boosted the Western economy. New roads, railroads, and towns sprang up around successful mines. However, most miners didn't get rich. Large companies and investors exploited the workers. The reality was different. Very few became rich. Most barely survived or ended up working as wage laborers in large companies' industrial mines. The rush also accelerated the displacement of indigenous peoples by occupying and controlling lands where minerals were found. The westward expansion of the United States was driven by the doctrine of manifest destiny, the idea that it was the right and duty of Americans to colonize all the land on the continent. This involved taking lands that had been inhabited by indigenous peoples for centuries. There were unfair treaties, many of which promised land, food, or protection, but were later violated by the government or settlers. There were also battles that show how indigenous people resisted, but were outgunned and outgunned. Ultimately, the indigenous peoples were forced to relocate to reservations, areas much smaller and less productive than their original lands. The lives of indigenous peoples changed drastically. Access to hunting, fishing, and traditional agricultural lands was lost, and with it, ancient ways of life and customs disappeared. Communities and families were broken up. Children were sent to residential schools to be assimilated and abandon their culture and language. Indigenous spirituality and religion were also repressed. Sacred temples and ceremonial sites were destroyed or made inaccessible. Some gold and silver fields occupied indigenous lands. Settlers and mining companies disregarded the rights of native peoples, and those who resisted were criminalized, persecuted, or killed. The economic expansion of the West depended, in part, on their removal or subjugation. For the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Apache, this was not the Wild West. It was their home. The sound of the approaching railroad was not progress. It was the roar of a steel monster devouring the hunting plains and splitting their world in two. The advance of the settlers was not an adventure. It was a slow and relentless invasion. From the hills, they watched with a mixture of contempt and profound pain as military forts were erected and fur trappers exterminated the great buffalo herds, the lifeblood of their livelihood and culture. Their resistance was not that of irrational savages, but the desperate struggle of a people to protect everything they held dear. The Wild West was not just a land of adventure and cowboys. For indigenous peoples, it was a social, cultural, and human catastrophe, where violence, forced expulsion, and the loss of their territory marked entire generations. During the Wild West, at dusk, the heart of the town was the saloon. There, amidst tobacco smoke, cheap whiskey, and marked cards, the hardships of the day were forgotten. Saloons were the center of social life in many Western towns. There, men would finish their long days of work as cowboys, miners, or traders. It was a place to drink, play cards, or gamble, but also a space where the law was weak or almost non-existent. Conflicts arose easily because stress, alcohol, and poverty created constant tension. Card games like poker or faro were common, and many gambled what little they had. An unpaid debt could escalate quickly. An insulted or humiliated player might resort to immediate violence. There were no effective legal methods for collecting small debts. Justice was meted out by force, often with a gun or knife. Disputes over women were common in small towns. Most men competed for the attention of a few available women. Women who worked in saloons or lodging houses were exposed to harassment or violence, and their protection depended on the strength of the men who accompanied or hired them. Fights stemming from jealousy or romantic rivalries could end in serious injury or murder, and almost always went unpunished if the sheriff didn't intervene. Most men carried a pistol or rifle. There were no gun controls, so a verbal dispute could escalate into a duel or shootout in seconds. Saloons were designed so that fights could spread quickly. Tables, chairs, and bottles served as improvised weapons. Residents lived in constant fear. A misinterpreted glance, a lost bet, or an inappropriate comment could cost them their lives. This created an atmosphere of mistrust, but also of respect. Learning to defend oneself was part of survival. Many conflicts ended without legal intervention, reinforcing the culture of violence as a resolution tool. The Wild West was a land of opportunity, yes, but also of hunger, disease, and loneliness. Many families lived in makeshift cabins, dependent on a hostile climate and the constant threat of attack or robbery. Food was scarce and basic. Beans, stale bread, salted meat, or occasional game. Many relied on their own crops or livestock, which could be ruined by drought, pests, or disease. Food shortages particularly affected children and the elderly, causing malnutrition and weakness in the face of illness. The lack of clean water and sanitation facilitated epidemics of cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, and tuberculosis. Injuries from accidents, falls from horses, or work tools were common, but doctors were scarce and medicines were rudimentary. Many people died young, especially women in childbirth and children from preventable diseases. Families lived miles from the nearest neighbor. This meant extreme isolation, limited contact with other people, services, or help in an emergency. The distance and lack of transportation made even a simple medical problem potentially life-threatening. Daily life was marked by dependence on the weather and immediate resources. Drought could ruin crops, and intense cold made survival difficult. In addition to natural challenges, there was the constant threat of bandits and raids. Farmers and families could be robbed or attacked by those seeking to take advantage of the precarious situation. Communities often defended themselves with weapons, and self-protection became part of daily routine. Homes were wooden or mud huts or makeshift tents, built with locally available materials. They lacked thermal insulation and protection from storms or snow. The precariousness of the dwellings reflected life itself. Surviving another day was a constant achievement. Over time, writers and, later, Hollywood, transformed that difficult life into legend. They created heroes and villains, lone gunfighters, wild Indians, brave sheriffs. The reality was different. There was violence, but also commerce, agriculture, communities struggling to survive and coexist. The Wild West was a brief time in history, but it left an eternal mark on popular culture. It was a collision. The violent collision between East and West, between new and old, between hope and despair. It wasn't won with heroism. It was conquered with sweat, disease, bullets, and endless cruelty. And his legacy is not just a cowboy legend, but a deep wound in the land and in the memory of a nation which still hasn't fully healed today. A frontier where myths were forged, where life was uncertain, and every day could be decided between the law of the gun or the hope of a better future.